Welcome to the 5-Minute Thinker. We spend just 5 minutes thinking on the important issues in life here. We talk about philosophy, theology, and apologetics. I'm Dr. Rasor, author, pastor, and professor, and not necessarily in that order. I've been dealing in the church and ministering in the church and also in higher education for more than 20 years now. If you haven't done so yet, check out my More Than 5 podcast over at my YouTube channel. Before I begin, I'd like to do one thing here up front, and that is first I want to make a shout out to my friends Tim Stratton and Josh Klein over at Free Thinking Ministries. We do a lot of work together for the kingdom of Christ. I would love for you to check it out over at freethinkingministries.com. Now, question, should we wager on whether God exists or not? The 17th century Christian philosopher and theologian thought so. So let's find out why. The 17th century Christian philosopher and theologian by the name of Blaise Pascal is known for his idea and argument for the existence of God known as pascalswager. The overall idea is this: it's better to wager that God does exist because it's more probable that you will gain infinite happiness and goodness in comparison to if you did not wager that he exists. As Pascal begins in his work Pensees, which just basically means musings, he tells us that we got to first note that we assume that the traditional philosophical arguments for God's existence are not valid. You see, he lived in a time of extreme skepticism and in the early Enlightenment period when reasoning, particularly human rationality and thinking through arguments of God's existence, like with the cosmological argument and the teleological argument, and others like those, were invalid. And so we had to be skeptical. We had to punt and say we can't really know if God exists based upon this human reasoning. So what Pascal begins to do is he assumes that human reason cannot decide whether God actually exists. So he's trying to play on the field of the skeptic. But Pascal responds that really we must all choose whether God exists or not. We can't just not decide. We have no option but to choose. We either believe God exists or we do not. And sooner or later, we're going to be faced with whether he exists, namely when we die. And so in his work, he prods the atheist to consider choosing what he desires the least. That is, belief in God. After all, he is an atheist. He's a skeptic. If the atheist continues not to believe in God, but God in fact exists, he has two things to lose, namely the true and the good. Now, we can actually see, I think obviously, which wager is the best. To bet that God exists rather than to bet that he doesn't exist. And Pascal has us consider it this way. If God does not exist, then the atheist loses nothing. But he also gains nothing. However, if God does exist, then the atheist has everything to lose, an infinite number of goods to lose, in fact. And so the best thing to do here is for the atheist, if he desires to obtain the true and the good, that is genuine happiness, like most people do, is to bet that God exists. Because if the atheist doesn't bet that, if he doesn't wager on the existence of God, and God actually does exist, then he has lost everything. Now here's another way to think about it if you're finding it difficult to grasp. For the atheist, assume you're an atheist, and if God exists, then the atheist is doomed. If God does not exist, then of course the atheist loses nothing. However, if you're a believer in God and God exists, you're going to gain everything. But if you're a believer and God does not exist, you don't lose anything. So either way, in a very real sense, the believer wins the wager, no matter if God exists or not. Now, Blaise Pascal actually considers this and says that he would, quote, have far more fear of being mistaken and of finding that the Christian religion was true than of not being mistaken and believing it true. In other words, he much rather have been mistaken in believing that God exists, because you really don't lose anything, than to be an atheist and you've wagered that, oh, God doesn't exist, but then you find out that he does exist, because you're going to lose a lot, an infinite number of goods. But here's a question. Should we bet or wager on something so important? I mean, is this really a practical way to go about making good or tough decisions in life? Things that are so important, such as the existence of God? Well, interestingly enough, Pascal thinks so. For one thing, you have an infinite gain if it turns out that you wagered in favor of God's existence and he actually exists. You win an infinite amount of good, namely salvation, God's goodness, and the joy and love that he has to offer in communion and relationship with him for eternity. Also, by wagering in favor of God's existence, you even experience goodness in this life. The reason why is because the Christian faith teaches to be faithful, honest, humble, and many other virtues and values that have been observed by not just Christians, but all people to be beneficial and good in this life. Ultimately, then, there's really no downside to wagering that God exists. You win in this life, and you win in the next life if God exists. But if God doesn't exist, you don't lose anything at all. So, what do you think? Is it better to wager that God exists or not? Should we wager? Leave your comments below in the comments section. I'd love to hear your thoughts.